You know, I think we're actually going to piss some people off with this one. They're not my rules. If you want to play the game really well, you first have to know the rules. Let's talk about some of the concrete rules that you need to know if you want to buy, breed, or become an asset to the keeping community of Dwarf and Super Dwarf reticulated pythons. So Dwarf and Super Dwarf retics are one example that I think is cool, where the pet trade discovered something new before science did, and then the scientific community chased down afterwards to find out what was going on. In the 90s, I think, the animals started to be imported, and they were these island localities of really, really small retics. They're naturally occurring, and they come from a certain group of islands south of Sulawesi. So now we have these amazing small population snakes. And it was so exciting, guys, because what other species do you know that is bred not just color and pattern in those two dimensions, but in the third dimension of size as well, especially to such a degree of being what's almost the largest snake on the planet to a very, very manageable size as a pet, like the pure super dwarves are. In all of that excitement, different breeders took them different ways. Some breeders emphasized bringing the morphs in and packing those new morphs. This was in the 90s, guys. It was in the height of the morph craze. And so breeding those super dwarf or dwarf animals into that morph carried the name across. Those would be 50%ers. And they grabbed those 50%ers and ran them out to a bunch of morphs, carrying that name all along. Other breeders, on the other hand, completely geeked out about this new variety of animals and loved them even in the wild type. And so they would proliferate either pure super dwarf and dwarf animals, or occasionally mix some dwarf and super dwarf morphs in, and they ran it down the higher percentage route. What happened next was a massive disparity in size, and things labeled as dwarfs or super dwarfs were ranging right on up to the mainland size, and then some of them were outrageously small, even being bred alongside of ball pythons, and it was everything in between. Because of the new market and all this new information and the difference in bloodlines, a lot of people lost interest in the Super Dwarf project altogether, saying things like, it's completely unpredictable, animals called dwarfs and super dwarfs get all kinds of sizes, it's not reliable at all, because they were generalizing the entire market. So the powers that be, which were not me at the time, decided to come out with some simple ground rules so that we could control the quality of the dwarf and super dwarf market in order to make sure that the animals not only are going to good homes who get an animal that they were expecting so they could best care for it, but also to protect the integrity of that market long term, so that as more enthusiastic people began to keep as pets, think about the possibility of breeding later on, that those people like me, you know, little Garrett when I was a kid or whatever, would actually have a market and a place in which we could enjoy with these amazing animals. Let me take you through those rules right now. All right, rule number 1. Before we start talking about crosses, we need to know what we're talking about with dwarf and super dwarf anyway. So if you check out reachoutreptiles.com, you'll actually find a poster with the 7 dwarf and super dwarf localities that we have available in captivity. They've got really funny names like Slayer, Tombalongans, we've got Kiowatis and Jampayas, and then of course, the Karampas, Kalatoas, and Madus. Now each of those islands has different traits. We call them different localities. They may have different colors, slightly different patterns, different sizes as adults. And because there's so many of them, you've got to catch them all. It's basically real life Pokemon out here. When you start making super dwarf crosses, and the morph stuff, what you're actually doing is breeding out to other varieties, mainland varieties, and you're diluting that bloodline. Let's take the classic Jampaya, for example. They are the locality that really started it all. They're the classic dwarfs, and they're nearly extinct because this principle was not well followed by people over the past few decades. The principle is this: if I want to sell you an animal as a pure Jampaya, it has to be 100% bloodline from that island and that island only. Okay, now the issue here is a lot of people bred them into mainland albinos or tigers or platinum sunfires, any of the morphs. In fact, the only morph that was ever produced as a pure Jampea in captivity was the anerythristic. So those anery Jampeyas are going to be the only morph you can get from that particular island. Now, if I wanted to make exceptional Jampea crosses, I could cross a pure Jampea, 100% only from that island, into a morph and get those 50% Jampea babies. If I took a 50%er then, grew it up and bred it back to a pure Jampea, they'd be 75%. Are you guys following me on the math? Mom plus dad divided by 2. 75% to 100% is 87.5%, and so on and so on and so on. Every generation I breed back to Jampea, I get halfway from that number back to 100, but I will never get all the way there. So let's say, for example, that if I was upstairs in my house, I'm a pure Jampea, and down here at the bottom, 0% dwarf, let's pretend I'm a tiger, okay? Rawr. If I want to make a tiger, as much Jampea as I can, and I breed it, that pure Jampea, which is up in the house, to a tiger, I can get halfway up the stairs. Now, if I took it another generation, then I can get halfway closer again. In the third generation, I'm getting ridiculously close to being in the house. If I went 4 generations, I could get a tiger that was so close to being inside of this house. Now, I can go halfway from here, and halfway, and halfway, and halfway, and those percentages of animal that was left from mainland is getting smaller and smaller and smaller every step of the way. But I will never, ever be in the house. All right, so rule number 2, we're gonna get into these crosses a little bit, and that rule is, if you wanna call it a dwarf or a super dwarf, it's gotta be 50% or more. Now, this one's kind of obvious. You want to have a decent amount of dwarf and super dwarf blood in your morph projects so that they are predictably small, right? Total common sense. So you might ask, Garrett, why would anyone ever make anything that was less than 50%? Because a lot of times, more complicated combinations require 2 and 3 gene combos. And so sometimes, through the process of selective breeding, you dip below that a little bit to get some more genes in there, and then you bring it back towards the pure super dwarf or dwarf side by breeding it to those locality animals, and it's always a back and forth. You see, when somebody makes a super dwarf albino, they say, that's great, but can you make it now a super dwarf albino tiger? So you gotta go back to mainland to put the tiger in there, then you gotta go back to super dwarf to make it a lot. And this is why these bloodlines take time. Now, there's nothing wrong with that process, but a bloodline isn't really considered like perfected as a dwarf or a super dwarf bloodline unless it has that magic 50% or more. Now, the localities, let's talk about them here. This is the poster that I was talking to you guys about that you can actually buy for your own reptile room at reachoutreptiles.com. Shameless plug. But it's pretty cool. For me, I'm super stoked to see all of these localities, the islands that they come from, and some typical adult sizes referenced in one place. So if you're a super nerd about the locality stuff, you can study them here. The way that something's considered a dwarf or a super dwarf is not necessarily governed by size. Instead, what happened in the beginning was certain island races were branded as dwarfs or super dwarfs according to their sizes as adults, but once everything was crossed into mainlands back and forth, or a dwarf to a super dwarf out to mainland, it's all over the place. So these are really only named after the percentages what they came from. Now, there's a little bit of debate as to the dwarf and super dwarf and which localities are which and so on and so forth, but these are the island chain that they come from south of Sulawesi. Now, Slayer and Jampea are considered the dwarfs. They're the animals, here's a mainland compared to a man, they're the animals that are here. Madu, Kalatoa, Karampa, those are the islands down here. Here's Slayer and Jampea. These 3 islands here are considered super dwarfs. Now there's 2 little tiny islands that are kind of off by themselves, similar in size to those super dwarf islands, but closer in location to the Dwarf Islands. So there's a little bit of debate about these. Coyotes are traditionally referred to as Super Dwarves, more in the American market. You Europeans like to call them Dwarfs. Tombolongans are the opposites. The Europeans like to call those Super Dwarves. Americans, well, Americans don't really know about Tombolongans. There's only one pair that's ever bred. I think we're the only ones. We did one breeding where we crossed Tombolongans into a morph. They turned out beautiful, but those are the only ones out there. So, Coyote, Tombolongan, Dwarf, Super Dwarf, whatever. You know, Slayer, Jamp, that's Dwarf. Madu, Kalatoa, and Karampa, undisputed Super Dwarfs. To call something a Super Dwarf, I need a combined 50% of these localities. You could potentially dip into these. That's arguable. I don't want to argue it because as a Dwarf and Super Dwarf breeder, I hate those terms anyways, guys. Just buy the poster, learn the localities. You'll know everything then, and you don't have to call it a Dwarf or a Super Dwarf. You can just call it a 50% Kalatoa because you have knowledgeable bloodlines. But according to the rules, this is the way it works. Let's say I had something that was 25% Kalatoa, 25% Karampa, and the rest of it was mainland. Well, those two islands are Super Dwarf islands, so added together, we could call that a Super Dwarf, whatever it was, for marketing purposes. If I had something that was 50% Slayer and 25% Jampea, that would be a combined total of 75% Dwarf. So that animal would be a Dwarf. Here's where it gets a little bit confusing. What if I have something that's 25% Jampea and 25% Kalatoa? That's actually a pretty common cross. And the way that this works is that any Super Dwarf locality blood can be considered, you know, a dwarf. If you just want to shorten it down and say, hey, it's a dwarf albino, but it has 25% Kalatoa, 25% Jampea, you could call that a dwarf, or you could call it a dwarf / Super Dwarf. But what you could not call that is a Super Dwarf, because to achieve that Super Dwarf status, it has to be 50% above from these localities. Arguably these. You could have a 50% Tombolong and call it a Super Dwarf, or a Coyote and call it a Super Dwarf. Those are these little guys here that are in between. Does that make sense? It's kind of like, you guys remember like 4th grade introduction to geometry? The definition of a rectangle is a shape that has 4 right angles. So a square has 4 right angles, right? So a square counts as a rectangle, but a rectangle doesn't count as a square. For a rectangle to be counted as a square, it would have to have 4 right angles and 4 even sides, whereas a rectangle has uneven sides with those 4 right angles. So Super Dwarf blood could be counted towards something that's a dwarf albino. It usually means that that animal could be called, let's say, a dwarf albino, but it might actually be a little bit better size genetics, smaller that is, than your standard dwarf albino, because a lot of those size comes from actually the Super Dwarf bloodlines. I know it's a little bit confusing, but the part that's easy is this. 50% from these islands or higher. If you didn't track it, you can't count it because you don't know the numbers. So pay attention to your bloodlines. These things work like purebred dogs. You don't want to be buying a black lab from a box outside of Walmart. You need to get it from your breeder to know that it was a black lab. Rule number 3 is, can you see it? Do not guess at the locality. Not based on looks, not based on your human error capable expertise, not based on I put a picture on Facebook and I said, hey guys, I got this really small snake that's 4 years old. Can someone tell me what pure locality it is? If you don't know, do not guess. Why? Let me tell you. The problem with guessing at a locality or not being certain or having questions about a locality animal and then breeding it into locality projects is that certain bloodline information gets lost forever. Check this ridiculously awesome animal out. This is a pure Kalatoa. This is where it all started. This boy is an old man. He's wild caught and brought in, and this particular animal is just a phenomenal snake. You can see why they call them Super Dwarves, right? When you look at this guy. Now, not every Kalatoa looks as good as this guy does right now. So with me as a collector, you know, I want to know that I have each of those 7 localities and that they're legitimate. There's no albino in there that was bred in from a Malaysian or a Javan or a Sumatran animal crossed in somewhere back along the line. So not only would I care that this is 100% absolutely a pure Kalatoa, not just because something gets the size of a Kalatoa or kind of looks like a Kalatoa, but is from that island, because I want to preserve that bloodline. That's my interest. Now, if I was in your shoes and I was going to buy, say, a Kalatoa, you might want to know more than just the fact that this animal was pure Kalatoa. You might want to know, hey, Garrett, remember that ridiculously good-looking animal that was in your video about the Superdwarf rules? What kind of Kalatoa is that? Can I get a baby from him? And so we actually usually kind of name these and create bloodlines. So these are just nicknames. It's the name of the animal. This one was actually named by the late, great Forrest Fanning. He called it the Reach Dreams line Kalatoa male. He had a good eye for quality and actually was able to buy this as a holdback from an importer who brought in a ton of animals, and this was the best one they brought in. Okay, so here's the problem if you guess. You actually destroy the future of the industry's hope of ever owning an animal like this, a pure Kalatoa, exactly the way they come out of the wild. Let me show you exactly what I mean by that. Okay, so the very first group of Superdwarf animals were named that because they didn't know which of those 3 islands they came from. The importer had given them the information that these animals were imported from the islands around Kalatoa. A big group of animals came in, probably from multiple localities, Karrampa, Madu, Kalatoa, and then those were mixed to create those pure Superdwarfs, which founded a bunch of those original bloodlines. I still have some of those original animals today. This is the great thing about a bloodline, is that you can trace it all the way back. So this is an animal that was bred by a guy named Brian Kaimala, who got his animals from a guy named Dan Yurimovich of Pro Reptiles in Canada, one of the first people to get animals from the original shipment of animals that were imported from around Kalatoa. I absolutely love this animal, but because she came from a group of animals that were collected from around the islands of Kalatoa, she could be 87.5% Kalatoa and 12.5% Madu, or something like that. Now, she's 100% Superdwarf, but I would never want to breed her to like the Reach Dreams Kalatoa male and then pass the babies on as Kalatoas, because there's a chance that I'm eliminating the natural bloodline that's there by crossing it in with something from another island. In order to be like a top level Superdwarf breeder, you gotta know the history of your bloodlines. And that, my friends, is rule number 3. Do not guess at what you don't know. But do you think anyone will notice the entire episode is shot with a giant like wet spot on my crotch? That's not very noticeable, right?
Nobody be looking at your crotch, Garrett.
And if you want to watch the next video, look right here. And this way, by having this video at the very, very end, people will be like, oh man, did I notice that he has a wet crotch? Let me go back and watch the whole episode and find out. We'll double our watch time. It's still pooping on me.